Hello guys, this is Azhar and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are going to learn about how Kubernetes architecture works. In real-time production environment, Kubernetes works in master-slave architecture. In master node, we will have kube API server, kube scheduler, kube controller manager and etcd database. And on each worker node, we will have kubelet, kube proxy and container runtime. So first we will see what is the role of each components, as like kube API server is an entry point and every operations happen through the API server within the cluster, which is responsible for authenticate and validate user request and interact with controller manager, etcd and scheduler. Kube scheduler is responsible to decide right node for the pod, and controller manager maintain the desired state of the cluster and watch the current state of the cluster to store in etcd database by kube API server. And it has many controllers such as node controller, replication controller, namespace controller, deployment controller, replication controller, PV controller, job controller, daemon set controller and service account controller. For example, node controller monitor the status of node. If any node goes down, so responsible to create node. And replication controller monitor the status of pod. If any pod goes down, so responsible to create the pod. Now coming to the etcd database, which stores all information related to cluster, and it is a NoSQL database which stores information in key value form. Now coming to kubelet is responsible for activity which interacts with container and nodes, and kube proxy is responsible for communication between pods, manage DNS and assign IP addresses to pod and also route request to right pod. And container runtime engine, for example, it can be Docker, and which is responsible for container creation. Now we will see the entire workflow of Kubernetes architecture when user submit the request into Kubernetes cluster for pod creation to deploy an application. When user submit the request for pod creation, this request means this instruction will go to the API server. So based on the pod requirement, kube API server create the pod. Once pod created, scheduler continuously checks with the API server for pod. If any pod came, so scheduler find out the node with available resources based on the pods, and this information sent to the API server. Now kube API server send the request to kubelet of that node for scheduling pod, and then kubelet request to Docker runtime engine for creating container. Once container created, kubelet reply to kube API server with the status of pod. Kube API server interact with etcd database to store information regarding that pod, like this pod schedule on this particular node. This was the overview how Kubernetes architecture works.